Greetings, friends. My name is Jessa McLean, and I'm here to provide you with some blueprints of disruption. This weekly podcast is dedicated to amplifying the work of activists, examining power structures, and sharing the success stories from the grassroots. Through these discussions, we hope to provide folks with the tools and the inspiration they need to start to dismantle capitalism, decolonize our spaces, and bring about the political revolution that we know we need.
Who keeps us safe? Is it the police? No. We know that's not true. We know the harm that the police constantly cause to our communities, and we're used to seeing lines of cops at our demonstrations, evicting encampments, supporting illegal evictions, and generally opposing our every effort to bring change and support to the most vulnerable members of our communities. Those same communities are often the most victimized by police. We keep us safe. However, there's a lot of work to do before we see any genuine defunding of the police in our municipalities, or better yet, abolishment. Look no further than Toronto City Hall, who recently caved against Toronto Police lobbying efforts to increase their budget even further than what it was already being increased. In this episode, Jess and I talked to Desmond Cole and learned so much about exactly what work needs to be done. Desmond has so much knowledge to share, and he challenges us in exactly the way we need to be challenged in order to bring effective change. I cannot emphasize enough how much I took away from this episode, and I'm sure you will agree. Let's listen in.
Hello there, Desmond. Can you introduce yourself to the audience, please?
Thank you. My name's Desmond Cole. I'm a journalist, author, and activist based here in Toronto.
We're really excited to have you on the show for a bunch of reasons. We often lean on your work to do some of the stuff that we do, but we know that you are very versed in Toronto politics, in particular, the efforts to defund the police and hold politicians accountable. We especially kind of went over your article that you wrote immediately following Olivia Chow's mayoral victory last year. And we can safely say you went in eyes wide open. I think there's a lot of people that have seen developments happen and they are heartbroken and shocked. But rereading that article again today, you mentioned police 15 times. I did a, search of mine just to see. You were pretty critical of where she might land in terms of police. And I think I had forgotten about that because I was surprised when Olivia Chow capitulated the complete funding request for Toronto Police, even though I think I've spent the last few months complaining about everything she does. I'm often pretty biased there. How do you look back at that article now? Do you feel vindicated, or do you feel like perhaps she even fell short of your expectations?
Well, first of all, Jessa and Santiago, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with both of you. No, I don't feel vindicated. I think vindication comes maybe with like a sense of relief that something turned out the way that you hoped or thought that it would, and there isn't really any of that here. It's always really important to set our expectations in a fair way. And I did talk in that piece a lot about Olivia Chow's record coming into, becoming the mayor of Toronto earlier this year. And I think her record, let me say first of all that there probably isn't a politician that I can think of off the top of my head. There isn't a person that I can think of who would have a chance of leading the city of Toronto who wouldn't do most of the things that Olivia Chow's doing right now. I expected her to do these things not only because of her record in her past, but because of the climate of the city of Toronto and because of the kind of horizon for what I think is possible for somebody leading our city right now. And so in that regard, maybe I would attribute less of this to Olivia Chow individually and more of it to the trajectory of the city and, more importantly, our council. So there are 26 people, including Olivia Chow, on city council. And from what I saw, 21 of them, I believe, voted in favor of a $20 million increase for the police rather than, I think, the $7.5 million that was put on the table by Chow at the beginning of February. So if she had voted against the increase, the full 20 million versus 7.5, it would have still passed easily. And what would have happened is you have a mayor who looks on her first budget like on a major issue, she's out of sync with the rest of the city. Now, that is not to excuse Olivia Chow 1 inch. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that asking her to sweep in and turn on its head the city that we've existed in for a very long time now was never realistic. So I didn't expect Olivia Chow to come in and immediately challenge the police. I did think that her offering 7.5 million versus 20 was better. A smaller increase to the police is better than a larger one. I would prefer a reduction of police budgets, of course. I wonder if she proposed the 7.5 million to appease some of her critics, knowing that she was always going to vote for the full amount, or if really the complete full court press by the Police Association in Toronto changed her mind and made her feel like it wouldn't be a politically safe move to give them less than they asked for. I don't really know. It doesn't matter though, because the Council of Toronto wanted that increase. The increase was moved by Amber Morley, who a lot of people were telling me anyway was going to be a progressive breath of fresh air. And I mean, maybe you guys caught Amber Morley earlier this year inviting people to come skating with her and the cops. This is the city that we live in. Like, progressives are nevertheless terrified of any real challenge to police power. Or I say terrified as if I know what's in their hearts. I don't know if they're terrified or if they just believe in it. Maybe they believe that the police are going to solve all of our issues. Maybe they believe that there's no alternative in Toronto to policing. But this just goes so far beyond Olivia Chow, and it would have been unrealistic for people to think that she could somehow strong arm. What would she have needed? 9 more votes or so that she didn't get? Of people who, just because the mayor told them so, would automatically change their vote on the most contentious issue in Toronto politics. That was never going to happen. So this is a loss for everybody. It's a loss for people who believed in Olivia Chow. It's a loss for those of us who didn't believe she was going to do anything but still want dramatic changes in policing. It's a loss for the city of Toronto that has capitulated another huge chunk of its budget to the cops. It's a loss for Black and Indigenous and racialized and poor people because this gives the cops more resources and an emboldened kind of spirit to harm us. No one has won here except the police lobby and the police mob itself.
And they've been lining up wins, haven't they, Desmond? I mean, not just budget, but it feels like they have become the go-to solution for everything in the city. And now that you mention it, it did enter my mind that this was always the plan, because we go back to it often, but that first tweet that she sent out following October 7th was a direct call to Toronto police. And she's kind of continued that need for policing in response to protest, right? There was the other motion that Toronto Council passed recently that they're going to earmark money to surveil and monitor protests as though it's a criminal element. And your article is full of, like you say, her history of using police as a community solution. And to be honest, we've never really heard her talk about defunding the police, but
and so sorry to cut you, but why anybody would have thought that when it's never been part of her past or any mainstream politician's past, that's what I'm kind of wondering.
I think it was the last capitulation that really pissed me off, because it meant like all of that shit. Like, they spent some of their budget trying to get more money and going in the face of, a lot of the efforts of the people that we call on the show and that we believe in. And so it was really frustrating to give them that extra W. And I don't know what that $12.5 million actually does for police. It almost seemed like a matter of principle that they had to win that. And then she gave it to them, just like she gave Ford Ontario Place. And I know, like, we're not opening that because we could go on about that forever. But I feel like there's no fight there. So I want to ask you, in your article, you make it clear that, it should be business as usual for organizers. There should be no relenting. There should be no softball playing, because obviously we can't rely on single politicians to change what I'd like to get into later in that Toronto mentality that seems impervious to the defund the police movement. I think it's still a little bit surprising. Do you think enough pressure was put on her in the few months between her victory and the first big budget? Do you feel like people took your advice, or were some folks maybe sitting back and giving her the space and she didn't feel enough pressure?
It's a good question. I mean, how do we answer, right? Toronto is a very big place with a lot of different interests. I think that there was a lot of pressure brought to bear on Olivia Chow by a lot of people who have been saying for years that policing is not going to solve our problems, policing is going to exacerbate our problems, policing is itself a harm. Those, I think, voices have become more educated, more numerous, more vocal in the last several years, and I think that's good. The police union put up a very serious counter campaign to scare everyone. Yeah, they tried really hard to scare people. And, just imagine your worst nightmare if you don't give us every penny that we asked for. And let's remember what we would have been, grateful for if Olivia Chow had stuck to what she said in the beginning, and if Council had somehow gone along with her, which I don't think was ever going to happen, is still an increase to the police budget. We were always looking at an increase in 2024. Let's start there. I think you're right, Jessa, to bring up what's been happening with the massive organizing and mobilizing for Palestine. And that happened very early on into Olivia Chow's tenure. And so for those who were still holding on to hope that she was somehow going to be different on many of these issues, I think she dispelled that right away by kind of doing the, je téléphone à la police meme and literally being like, you all are in the streets. We're going to have to see what the police think about this. And she's kind of stuck to that. She tried to backtrack a little bit when she got the biggest backlash probably of her political career for doing that. But this is how institutional forces work. My question is this. I live downtown in Toronto. Were people in neighborhoods outside of downtown, were they calling for the defunding of the police as loudly as some of the people around the neighborhoods that I'm in? Were they doing that? If not, why not? Were we a united city making this call? Or was this coming from a lot of the pockets that actually were a big, part of Olivia Chow's base of support, whereas she thought, yeah, maybe some of you loud downtown people are angry about a police increase, but generally people aren't going to be too fussed about this. A lot of people voted for her in other parts of the city, and maybe she thought they're not gonna push back on me too much if I don't do this. I think where organizing continues to fail in this city is having that citywide response, mobilization, coordination, talking to one another, acting together. If you have the ability to go downtown on a Wednesday morning and afternoon to disrupt what's happening on budget day and make yourself visible, that's good. I'm not dissing that. I've been that person. I am that person many times over the years. Not everybody can do that. Not everybody who, say, lives in Malvern can come downtown for 9 a.m. on a weekday and make their presence felt. And I think that sometimes, because a lot of the people who do that see and know and work together, they forget about the entire rest of the city that isn't going to voice its displeasure in the ways that we are, or is not part of this conversation in the same way. I saw people putting out petitions. I shared even some of them to do things like freeze the police budget. I think the police budget should be massively slashed, but I still supported people who called for a freeze. I don't agree with the freeze ideologically, but because I'm like, a freeze to what end? We have to say what the purpose of freezing the police budget is. And if we believe that the police are causing as much harm as they are, a freeze is nowhere near the correct response, right? But I still support those things when they're out there, because I want to see us moving in the right direction. But like, how many of the thousands of people who signed that petition live outside of the downtown core and are not on social media every 10 minutes. Again, I'm not critiquing that. Who would I be to critique that? I'm on social media a lot myself. I live downtown. But is there a mass mobilization of people? Or is there a really loud, visible cadre of people? And we think that that should be enough, and we're surprised when it isn't. I guess that's kind of what I would ask. I think Olivia Chow was always going to go this way. Council was definitely always going to go this way. And certainly the police repression since October 7th made it probably more likely that Olivia Chow was too afraid and others too afraid to stand up to the police.
What you're talking about there reminds me a lot of a conversation we had during the election with Chloe Brown, right? About the importance of connecting outside of the downtown core, outside of, what we typically see on social media. And I admit that I haven't been thinking about that as much as of late. And so I don't really like. I guess the question is like, what? How do we begin that process of connecting our movements more with the different areas of Toronto? I think of because there's a lot to be done, especially in places like Scarborough, for example, right? There's a lot that needs to be done, and Scarborough issues are just not anyone's priority right now when they really should be. And I guess, how do we go about that change?
Well, we certainly don't do it by waking up a month before the budget happens and being like, oh my God, we've got to stop this increase from happening. We could be working on that for the next many years before we saw any more fruit. But it is the word connecting, Santiago, is, I think, correct, because there are already people out there who are doing this work in Scarborough, in North York, in North Etobicoke, right? There are already people who are doing this. And I just think that there's like a deep disconnect and a lack of coordination. So I don't know, like, where's the canvassing? Where are the door knocking campaigns where we actually go into communities, not during an election, to support a candidate and knock on people's doors and say, we're really concerned about the cops? Where are the events at councillors' public events where we go not just to disrupt, but to challenge their own supporters to be like, why do you support a police increase? Why don't you care? Or why aren't you more concerned? Why aren't you doing something about all the harm that the police are causing? The critique that I think I'm making here is that a lot of what I see happening, which ends up being visible, is initiated online and it stays there. And I think we're not going to get to level 2 until we are more out publicly in those ways, challenging, having conversations, building trust with people, and asking people to join us. Because again, you can make visibility online. You can gather a few thousand people who are quite active in this city, again, many of whom are active in a very particular way downtown. And when there's something going on, like a budget, you can get them to make a lot of noise, and they can even get some media attention. Because the media also loves to stay downtown and doesn't actually want to go and ask people in North Etobicoke how they feel about the police budget, if it doesn't have to. That's what I want to see. I want to see canvassing. I want to see relationship building and signing people up in different membership organizations so that they are actually working on these things. The way that Jane Finch Action Against Poverty has been doing for like 20 years. The way that groups in Scarborough who were fighting against closed circuit television cameras have been doing. Like, I want us to be able to expand and connect and think about this less as a one-off, we need to stop this thing from happening, and a long, slow grind of like building up public capacity.
Yeah, I remember that was something. A lot of memories are coming back now of things from the election cycle. We were talking about how this perhaps could be the opportunity to stop being reactive and start actually planning moves. Like, instead of having to constantly be responding to all the horrible things that are happening around us, we can actually try and, change something as opposed to stop something. And I feel like that feeling has dissipated quite a bit.
Well, it's so frustrating to hear. You're right, but it's frustrating to hear slow grind when it feels like an emergency. I totally get what you're talking about, making those connections. Some movements have been around longer and have built networks. The climate change movement seems particularly well at going local, deep canvassing, the Workers' Action Center and whatnot. But I guess when it's an issue that's just so pressing. I mean, you shared that CBC article not that long ago, and what does it say? Spectacularly unrelenting rise in fatal police shootings. I mean, I think Alberta was the most shocking there. The increases were abominable. I mean, not every province experienced it, but it was right across the country, and that was just the fatal shootings. The records there were awful. The article, I'll link it in the show notes. It tries to downplay it a lot. I wish perhaps, Desmond, they had called you for this one because, but 70% of them were armed. But that means 30% of those folks were unarmed. 30%! And there's no records on the race of most of the people shot by police because they just don't make the news. And, people are dying after wellness checks and calls for just, unwanted people on properties and whatnot. And it just seems like there's so much evidence out there, so much bad press for police. Even the article mentions like it's a disdain for police. And that's why there's confrontations between civilians and police is because we have no more respect for them. That's a bit of circular logic. But, everybody seems to be aware of the Defund the Police movement, but they're also aware of the harms police cause. I know there's a lot of people out there that still have the law and order goggles on, but I feel like there's been a lot of movement there. And I'm just wondering how, other than the deep canvassing, like what do you think is stopping most people from looking at defunding the police as a serious issue? Or some people, or as a possibility even, like that's a hurdle we have to cross with a lot of people. Like they just cannot fathom a world without police. Like it's just not in their realm of imagination, and they laugh it up. But you present these numbers like that article, or the amount of funds. Like I don't think people realize, we did an episode on it a while ago, but like some municipalities are spending like 50% of their money on cops, and what are they resistant to? Why is there no appetite for this yet, despite all of the evidence before people?
Right. So first of all, there is a huge appetite for it, and it isn't organized. That's what I'm trying to say. There's a huge, huge, huge appetite for this. So, for example, don't you think it's weird that even though spaces like Toronto Community Housing are among the most policed spaces in the city of Toronto, that there aren't all of these housing organized groups or tenants groups who are speaking up about policing? Like, isn't that odd? Wouldn't they be the most likely people to speak out since they're experiencing some of the harshest outcomes? It is out there. These sentiments are, but they're not organized. And I think even among people who are experiencing things like this, there might sometimes be a sentiment that what we wish we could have out of change for policing is not really possible and achievable. Let me go back. This issue of the kind of expanding fatal police activity in Canada in the last couple of years, right? So I brought up that CBC article as well so I could look at it again while we were talking, and it's 85 people at the time that the article was written, 85 people in Canada last year shot by the police, 41 of them fatally shot. It's really hard to get complete numbers. And remember, shot does not mean beaten to death, does not mean died in custody of unknown causes.
I didn't even think of that.
Well, the kind of breadth of police violence is so expansive that sometimes it's actually hard to conceive of it. So I want to say first off that these numbers give us an indication of how bad things are, but the vast, 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 vast majority of people who are harmed by the police are not shot and are not killed. And I think part of why we're not where we would like to be is because we live in a country whose biggest reaction ever against the police came after a police killing of a black person in a different country. The George Floyd era is over, y'all. It's over. But we thought when it was happening that something was changing in this country. Something was changing. Our awareness was changing. A certain level of outrage and urgency was definitely growing and has been growing in this country. I am happy that that has happened, and I don't want to discredit it. I think Robin Maynard said it really well when she said we went from Black Lives Matter as a slogan, as a rallying cry, to defund the police, a specific policy demand. And that's when the police were like, ah, shit, we got to do something about this because Black Lives Matter is bad enough, but now they're actually calling for something that we absolutely cannot afford to see. And you see how across Canada, the police have been actually lying and saying that they have been defunded, which none of them have. And they say, well, we need more money because you see, they defunded us. And then now there's all these bad things happening. Now, it's not true, but they've used that rhetoric. But let me go back to George Floyd. People in Canada know George Floyd's name. They know George Floyd's story. Many of them watched the last 10 minutes of George Floyd's life. I can't watch that video. I will never watch that video. I don't need to watch it. But how many people in Canada who know what happened to George Floyd can name anyone in their own country who's been killed by the police in recent years? A lot of them can't name a single person. Yet we were led to believe that the outrage over what happened to George Floyd was somehow going to translate into us completely overhauling our local policing systems. That is not realistic. The amount of, so there was like an awakening, and it was a big step forward, and maybe we have taken for granted that that was going to get us a lot further ahead than it has. And maybe we also didn't calculate the extreme backlash, which I'm describing now, which the police have engaged in since all of this Black Lives Matter, defund the police, abolish the police stuff has been going on. Maybe we didn't calculate that the police were not going to sit there and allow us to dismantle them. They worked very hard to build their fucking paramilitary empire, and they're not just going to give it up because some civilians are angry with them. So I think that's part of it, Jessa, is that the sensationalism of watching George Floyd be murdered, the grotesqueness of thinking that watching a person die is like an educational awakening experience, when what it actually is it's just titillation. It doesn't actually inform the mind. It doesn't honor all of the people around you who have had things happen to them who you're ignoring because you watched George Floyd die and think it's horrible. And so that was only going to get us so far. And it's gotten us as far now as I think that it can. And we have to be at a place in our country when we know the names of people who have been killed here, but also that we can appreciate the broader scope of policing that isn't just about murdering somebody. I mean, if you go to the Special Investigation Unit website for Ontario, it's almost daily that there's a report, an update, a decision about police harming someone in the province of Ontario. Sometimes there are multiple reports and releases in a day about police brutality. Almost none of those ever even make it to court.
Let alone the news.
Let alone the news. But let me go a level deeper now, because I said you don't have to get shot, right? And you're like, I'm not thinking about that. Okay, so you don't have to get shot to have an SIU report. You do have to get shot, killed, severely injured by the SIU's definition, which is like very narrow definition. So like the police have to break a bone in your body, or you have to lose a limb. The definition of serious injury under the SIU is very narrow. And there's been a lot of cases of people who've been hurt real bad by the police, and it never even warranted an SIU investigation. So not only do the vast majority of people not get killed by the police to be hurt by them, the vast majority of people who get hurt by the police, the vast majority, don't even have their situation investigated because it's not deemed to be serious enough. Let me give you an example. I know I'm talking a lot here. You just put a lot on the table for me, Jessa. Story of a 15-year-old boy, okay, in Jane and Finch recently, who was punched repeatedly in the face by a Toronto police officer. This one did go to the Special Investigations Unit. And after reviewing it, the SIU decided that they were going to clear the police officer who punched a 15-year-old boy 6 times in his face and head.
Offhand, do you know what the clear rate is?
Oh, in my book, which came out in 2020, I did a tabulation over several years. I think the number was 94%, but I would have to look. It is well above 90%. It's well above 90%. The police will tell you, well, just looking at the percentage of police who are cleared doesn't tell you anything. Like, there isn't an expected number of cops who should be getting charged. I would argue that any civilian who punches someone 6 times in the face is going to be charged. It doesn't mean that they're going to be convicted of a crime. It just means that it's going to be tried in court. Going back to this 15-year-old boy, if you read the SIU report on this or you read a news article about it, I've got one up right here. Let me describe how the SIU justifies not charging a police officer who punched a 15-year-old 6 times in his face. SIU Director Joseph Martino looked into whether the 6 punches the officer landed on the boy during the arrest were legally justified. He found the officer was within his rights when he punched the boy the first 3 times. As for the 3 additional punches, Martino said, quote, "Strictly speaking, I do not think it was objectively necessary to strike those additional blows," unquote. However, he noted that while he accepts that one or more of the punches were the cause to the serious injuries the boy suffered, quote, "I am unable to conclude with any confidence that the officer comported himself other than within the limits of the criminal law throughout their engagement. As such, there is no basis for proceeding with charges in this case."
What a farce.
That reminds me of when Sammy Yatim got shot, I think 9 times by James Forcillo, and a court said, the first few shots that you shot at this boy alone on a streetcar were fine. It's the second volley of shots that we had a problem with. And they ended up convicting James Forcillo of attempted murder, even though he actually killed Sammy Yatim by shooting him. There is always an out for the police. We have to figure out a way to engage people in conversations that say this kind of violence is never going to stop. It's not going to stop as long as there are police existing the way that they do today, and that we have the right to say no more of this. We have the right to ask for and demand something else. And I think we need to leave behind the sensationalism and the energy, not the energy of the George Floyd time was good, but we need to leave behind that kind of like, oh my God, something's about to happen right now. Like, this is the change. Like, we are seeing it right now because the whole world's talking about this. That's where the slow grind stuff we have to get back to. That was an awakening, and it set us a lot further forward than we've been for many years as a like kind of country in general. But until we are naming the people in our own communities who this is happening to, until we're getting as angry about it happening locally as we did for one person safely far away in another country, until we're willing. Do you know that when we ask people to like just do a basic thing, like call their counselor, you know how afraid people are, guys, to sometimes pick up the phone and have to have a conversation just like with a staff member in a counselor that they represent, because challenging authority in general is so hard. And that's what I wanted to say ultimately, Jessa, is that the reason we're not there yet is because challenging authority is like, for a reason, one of the most difficult things you can ask people to do, even if it's making a phone call. And a phone call ain't going to get us defunding of the police. And that's why there's so much more work to be done.
Yeah, no, I even with a script, some folks it's a hard barrier to get past. I want to go back to something you said though and explore a possibility. We spoke of, the physical harms that police do and that a lot of people are aware of. But I think perhaps one of the keys to connecting the movements towards this end lies in the, maybe not so much now, but less obvious harms that police do that are slowly becoming more obvious, I think, to organizers, in particular, the examples that we could provide for the pro-Palestinian movement and the use of police at York University and showing up for lectures. And, we posted video from Anna Littman and showing just walls of police being used to direct marches, to block people, just what most... The Avenue Road example, those folks described like 50 cop cars showing up to push them off of an overpass. And people can go back and listen to the details of just how many police resources were used for, although people were physically harmed there, it's that infringement on our democratic rights, right? And our ability to organize these other movements. So perhaps if we emphasize those harms as well, so it goes beyond the violence that we've already been exposed to, that we've already kind of reacted to and somewhat mobilized around, but that it doesn't become like that kind of niche issue, that it becomes intrinsically tied with the needs of all of the movements, because surely, like overall, that we talk about the political revolution that we need, and the police will not let that happen either, right? So they're there to protect not just capital, but power. The same power structures we're desperate to dismantle themselves. So I think having movements understand that better, even if it's a selfish reason, because my movement can't succeed with overfunded police, right? With a military police force here, we're never going to be able to disrupt the way that we need to, and can understand the urgency there, that it becomes part of that really important need before we can really do a lot of the other things that we need to do.
I think that coming at this from any angle that relates to people's daily lives is valuable. I've been interested, for example, to see people who cycle through High Park start to get really mobilized against police in the last couple of years, because the police started going into High Park and ignoring the cars speeding through the park and stopping cyclists to try and ticket them. And then kind of upping their presence in that neighborhood when the cyclists started organizing and being like, hey, you see how these guys are wasting our resources? The police got spiteful and just did it twice as hard, right? And this has actually like awakened a lot of people who I don't think were really paying attention when a lot of us have been talking about this for years. Now, again, they are downtown. There's a specific demographic. I still want them to organize and mobilize and agitate. But that's one entry point. I'll give you another one. I was in Mississauga today. Different city, same shit. On Hurontario Street, there's a lot of construction going on. And as this construction's happening, I'm there early this morning. There's an area that's really torn up and a lot of machinery driving through. I counted 6 police cruisers in the stretch of 3 or 4 blocks. Police cruisers sitting in the middle of the median area with their lights on and flashing. Not an officer to be seen, because they're just chilling in the car on their phones. They're not outside. They're not engaging with anyone.
They're probably filming TikToks.
Who knows what they're doing, man? This also is part of like the mob. Just giving people work because you control an entity that people in power cannot say no to. And I'm not saying the revolution is going to happen when people get mad at cops in construction sites. I'm just saying that there's 1,000 different avenues through which I think we can start to have these conversations. I will say, though, the most important avenue, and the one that I think takes the longest amount of time to start working on people on, even if they have some reservations about the police, is that these issues are always personalized. So what about you when you have a problem? How are you going to feel if the police don't come to your house and deal with your issue? And as trite as that is, it works. People might see 50 cops coming to Avenue Road to go after some pro-Palestinian demonstrators and say, what a waste of resources, that's so wrong. But they're not going to get all the way to, therefore, take away their budgets without something more personal, something more internalized and reflective and thoughtful. That's not, again, a reaction to something so sensational. And I think where we have to start to go with all of these conversations is, why are the people sitting in those cars on here, Ontario, with their lights flashing, why are they armed? Why do they have a license to kill someone? What does that have to do with their presence in a construction area? Because do you know what? If they're there for visibility, I support that. And I would like someone who is not armed with a license to kill to provide visibility for traffic in a construction site. I want someone to do that work, just not them. Why are they in our schools with our children, as they are all over the Greater Toronto Area and all across this country? Why are they in our schools? If there's an issue with dangerous behavior in our schools, I want someone to deal with it. But you know who it should be? A teacher, a principal, somebody who is there to work with and build relationships with kids. We successfully made that argument in Toronto. And of all of the big campaigns in Canada against police in recent years, I'd say that the campaign to get cops out of schools has been one of the more successful ones. We've seen it in Hamilton. We've seen it in Waterloo region. We've seen it in a lot of places where now the police are trying to get back in. But the fact is that we've gotten them out in many places. And that's not because there was some sensational single event that the whole country started talking about. It's because people went into individual schools and talked to people who have had negative experiences with the police. They talked to undocumented people who are like, I actually can't go to school if that cop's there. And they formed alliances and relationships and campaigns that were local to a specific place, right? And this is why I bring up George Floyd, because something that happens in Minneapolis isn't going to create local organizing in Ottawa or Hamilton or anywhere else. So challenging why people in our society need to have lethal force, why they need to have the weapons that allow them to use that lethal force, and why they should be in our midst in all of these places where someone else should be doing the job that they're doing. That's where I feel like that's maybe like the level that we need to move towards now.
And for me, there's a level of frustration there in how much more difficult it is when there's so many examples, right, that we can pull of police, whether it's the Avenue Road, whether it's all of these recent protests. We can pull a million examples of police working against a movement. And then I think back to last year when there was the sensationalization around the quote-unquote violence on the TTC, right? When there was several high-profile incidents, and then the police, there was an increased police presence as a result of that, and a lot of people were justifying that, right? A lot of people that was not a moment where we were succeeding in making the arguments, even though it wasn't making it never made anybody safer, and there was the whole thing, the whole supposed wave of violence was really just media spotlighting high-profile incidents and failing to show that transit still remains pretty much the safest way to get around the city, right? So I think, when it comes to those narratives, we often don't do a really good job there. And I guess my concern is, like, how do we respond in those moments when there is something like, the whole wave of the TTC thing? Like, how do we prepare people to be able to talk about this better?
I think, though, it's hard in those sensational moments, though. I think going back to what Desmond's talking about, that slow grind is doing the work when people aren't being whipped up into a frenzy about crime, because it is really hard to provide an alternative in those circumstances. Other ones are a little bit easier to make that transition. The traffic, in schools, lots of examples where police are definitely used when they shouldn't be. And I think providing those alternatives constantly, rather like Anna Jessup was on and she paired, it's not just defund the police, it's also reinvesting in the community. And I think back to the 12.5 million extra that the police ended up getting from a reserve fund and wondering where that money would have gone anyway. Like, do people even have faith that the alternative will be done? That if we draw money from the police budget, we won't just give it to landlords as a tax rebate, or that it will be invested in the necessary community supports to replace policing services. And I don't see a lot of that, because that's like the refuting that Desmond was talking about, where what are you going to do when a man tries to rob your house, right? Like, that's the scenario they put you in, and everyone's going, I don't even know.
I do want to add then one maybe more difficult scenario.
That was for Desmond then.
This is one that I feel that set us back quite a bit, which was, the Freedom Convoy. And, we were very critical at the time of people who are on our side who were in support of the use of the police then. That was a moment, that people still kind of haven't let that one go. I guess, yeah. I don't really know how to frame my question there, but
no, I mean, you're laying a lot of stuff out here. I think what you're both pointing to, first of all, is the idea that the sensationalism works both ways. The sensationalism can capture people's attention in a moment and draw sympathy and concern and demands for change. But as with the spate of violent incidents reported on the TTC, it can also make people so afraid that they say, well, we need more police right now. How do you combat that? Well, I mean, you don't in the moment, because if the entire media apparatus, there was a story, okay, when those whole spate of incidents were being reported on, there was a story that a group of boys, young men, had swarmed. That was the word that was used in the media, swarmed a TTC driver. And I heard that story and I was really interested in it. And there was some follow-up reporting and some videos that came out. Because what these boys said happened was that a TTC driver actually got out of the little booth that the driver has at the front of the bus, and he grabbed one of them. And it was when he grabbed one of them that the rest of them responded and went after him. So this idea of a bunch of boys just because they were having a ball, just swarming a driver, it sounds so scary to people, but it's not even what happened. But I would add that the level of education that it takes to get people to a point, and the level of resolve, because it's not just a matter of information, the level of resolve and compassion and conviction to doing things in a different way that it takes to have people hear a story like that, if it were true. Let's just say for no reason that they felt like, other than that they felt like it, a bunch of boys just swarm a TTC officer. It takes a lot of conviction of your principles to be able to say, I still don't want more police after hearing such an awful story. Because I know that the police won't do anything in that situation to keep that driver safe. I do want that driver to be safe, but police aren't going to do it. That's a level of nuance and thoughtfulness that you don't just get by seeing a news story on television that makes you upset. So I think the urge to respond when things like these things, this reporting happens, I understand it, and I'm not saying we shouldn't respond, but we should maybe expect that that's going to be a really hard time to have a conversation, and that's why doing this on the everyday is more important than just trying to ride a media cycle. But, oh gosh, I also wanted to say, well, you brought up the whole Emergencies Act, Ottawa stuff, which we...
Let me just add a personal antidote before we go there, because it's that knee-jerk reaction to policing for violence, for theft, for every crime that is committed. And I don't know where it starts, because this is an anti-police household. Like, my kids know I will not play police officer. I don't want to play. I will try to redirect all the time. They know, but still, If my son does anything wrong, my daughter's first reaction is to go put him in prison. She does not hear this from me. I do not know where they get this from, but it's taught from obviously a very early age, like that there's a response to like isolate, and the police will come in and take away bad people, strangers. This is not coming from me. She's not even in school yet. So it's coming from like some really basic television, kids' television. And it's just how we're taught from such a young age that this is the proper response to conflicts, is to use a police force, use an army response, use this violent, authoritative response that usually requires someone building a jail somewhere. And that's really frustrating for me because I'm trying to undo that before she's even gone out into the world. And I'm falling behind already. So I can only imagine how then, once you're at voting age, how long this has been repeated and reinforced in your mind as the only way forward. So, sorry. Back to the emergencies act, but...
Just throwing a quick anecdote, too. I can make it worse because I have a brother who's 6 years younger than me who I have... Like, he knows how I think. He's listened to me all of this. And his fascination with guns makes him like the police and like the military, and now he's doing cadet stuff, and he knows all the arguments. He's heard every argument of it.
I know some socialist gun clubs,
and I know I'm convincing, but like he will not hear it. Anyway, sorry.
No, don't be sorry. I find myself thinking about a woman whose son was actually killed in a subway stabbing in March of last year. I was thinking of her too. And the boy who was killed in that attack was Gabriel Magalhaes. I hope I'm saying that correctly. And it was his mother who came out after he was stabbed fatally on the TTC and did this unbelievable interview on CBC, Andrea Magalhaes, where she said, that it's so horrible to have to live with the loss of my child. And at the same time, I don't want to see this being used to cause more harm in our communities. And I want to read part of what she said.
I am partly doing this for Gabriel, but really I'm doing it for change, for the one word change.
What is it that you need from a conversation?
We need to start talking about violence, the root causes of violence. I know it comes down to the social determinants of health. It's not an easy solution. We're not talking about adding more police force. Mm-hmm. I'm not talking about locking people up. We're talking about what are the root causes? Why is this happening? Why is a person homeless? Why is a person not being able to access care, access supports? This is a first world country. I came from a third world country, a very violent country, Brazil. Mm-hmm. Why did I move away? I wanted a better life. I'm a nurse. I had a clinical placement in mental health hospitals. We, as a society, I find we love to blame one person. We blame the individual. Sometimes we even say you blame the victim. And we like to put all the responsibility on one person and say it is your fault. You picked up that knife. But could this have been prevented somehow from the beginning? How was this person, were they going to school? Did they have supports? Did they have a home? I don't know. I don't know anything. I cannot speak for this person.
I can't even imagine. And as you say that, I think about the politicians who, offer their support.
That is the time that I get angry. I'm going through phases, but that makes me angry, so angry. Because when they want votes, they promise everything. But how about action? How about what really needs to be done? So empty words make me mad. Don't live with fear. I don't want to hide in my house. I don't want my kids to hide at home. But can't we please get people to listen? Can we make effective change so we can all go outside and be able to breathe and feel safe? I feel like this is still an amazing city. We can do better. I want to stay here where my baby was born. I want to stay here for Lucas, but I would love to feel safer.
That broke me.
I cannot imagine how someone in that scenario, days after losing her child, found the ability to say these things publicly. That was very powerful for me. And I hold it in my heart, and I want to honor that she did that. And yet, even that kind of an appeal from a woman who went through it, who lived the thing that other people are afraid of, it is not enough. It is not enough. We have people in our own families, as you say, Santiago, who know what the harm is, who have experienced it themselves, but who for their own reasons just might want to see that harm visited on somebody else. This is a long struggle. It's a lifelong struggle, and no amount of one-off attention grabbing can, it can't change the daily pace of life where we all have our own things that we're dealing with. We all have other things to attend to. We get taken out of the moment, and when these things happen and we go, oh my God, but they themselves don't make lasting change. When it comes to what happened in Ottawa, we need to keep talking about what happened in Ottawa for a very long time and studying it and thinking about it. And, some people will say like, okay, the left failed. I'm all for having conversations about how shitty we all are. I think it's a little more complicated than sometimes just being like the left failed. I think we had bad analysis though. And I think if we want to start asking ourselves why it's so hard to defund and abolish the police, we need look no further than Ottawa during the convoy, when so many people who in other circumstances would say that they understand the need to get rid of the police, like I said, well, what about when the bad people come to your neighborhood? This is a perfect example of that. And seeing people who were like, yeah, get the police and get these people out of here. And I'll say too, a lot of people said that the problem with the Emergencies Act, which the courts recently found was used illegitimately by the Trudeau government, the problem with using those powers against the convoy, which was like a right-wing populist movement, is that that'll open the door for it to be used against all of us progressives in our organizing. I heard that over and over again. I take a perhaps slightly different view of it. I think that that's possible. It's possible that in the future the police could use, the federal government could use the Emergencies Act against left-wing movements and demonstrators. But they don't seem to need it when they want to go into Wet'suwet'en territory. They don't seem to need it when Black people demonstrating police brutality on the streets of Ottawa go and camp on the street as they did and were just mobbed and arrested en masse by the police in 2021. They haven't needed any emergency powers to clear the encampments in Toronto and Vancouver and Edmonton and Halifax. So I think we need a little bit deeper of an analysis there, because just the simple idea that they're coming for X now, so then they'll come for us one day, that is another example of a kind of sensationalist analysis that I don't think lends itself to kind of broader and deeper thinking about what's really wrong. What's really wrong is that when people come into your city and are demonstrating and setting off firecrackers and being incredibly disruptive, shitting in public parks and things like that, the impetus that maybe the cops are on our side now, so we should use them to get rid of these people, is really strong. So I keep going back to that. Was lethal force required to deal with the convoy demonstrators in Ottawa, as annoying as some people felt that they were. Was lethal force the correct response? Look, there were reports that people in that convoy demonstration had weapons. I don't doubt that that's likely. There were reports of people who kept their children in really deplorable conditions inside like trailers for days on end because they just wanted to stay in Ottawa and see this thing out.
They had tanks of propane, which they would not normally allow angry people to accumulate.
But so what? Send in the Marines? Like, this is my really difficult question for everybody. Does that mean that you can use any force necessary to get rid of them? And when you justify that, good luck. Because what you have now done is, I don't think it's like, oh, you know, the Emergencies Act paves the way. It's more of a thing where you have to kind of ask the other, like the average person, what's a reasonable response to this? What's a reasonable, non-lethal response to social disorder, to people disrupting and even maybe sometimes threatening other people? A lot of people were really quick to say, this isn't a demonstration. These aren't demonstrators. They shouldn't be called protesters. Well, what are they, terrorists? What are they?
Well, we hear that now, don't we? Like, I don't think it's so much sensationalist, though, to remind people that one day we will hopefully be in a position that we have mass movements in the street that are disruptive, that are working towards a certain end. And we absolutely can't feed into the narrative that police should just be able, or the army should just be able to remove us.
Well, let me say something, though, because Jessa, when that day comes, the law's not going to matter.
That is, but you're still feeding into that narrative.
I
right?
agree with you.
Yeah.
I totally agree with you. But when that day does come, no one's going to say, well, we can't crush them, guys, because the last time we used those laws, people got really mad at us. You know what I mean? Like, it's kind of a constant. I guess what I think about is when the police did come in full force, what did they actually do? I have saved a lot of the video from that day, from different, far right live streamers who were making a big buck live streaming every day, getting thousands of people around the world, some of them tens of thousands of people around the world to watch what was going on in Ottawa. And then they were there to witness the whole thing kind of get busted up when the huge mobilization of police came. So what did the police do? How did the police keep us all safe from these folks? Did they go in surgically and say, we heard that there are weapons here, we're confiscating them. We heard that there were people who committed violence, we're arresting and charging them? No, they didn't do that. They did what police always do. They lined up and, like the bullies that they are, they started using batons and hitting people in the legs, hitting people in the chest, hitting people in the face, pushing people to the ground, using their horses to brush into people and knock them to the ground. What did that do? Do you know what it did? It moved people a few blocks away from the thing that they were worried about, the Parliament building and the other government buildings in the area. And the night that they did that huge police surge, a big show of force to the public to say, see, we're getting rid of them, there were people in the streets a few blocks away from that same area doing the exact same thing that everybody had been complaining about, setting off fireworks in the middle of the night and the fireworks falling on their sides and like shooting out and almost hitting people, like pissing all over the streets, keeping people up way into the night. They did those things anyway, even after the huge police mobilization. Now, did that demoralize a bunch of people and make them go home? It did. It did, absolutely. But I think that they were validated, too, by the way that the police responded, just to push them a few blocks down the road. And I'm not going to sit here and say that I know what the better response was, but that wasn't it. And a creative set of solutions needs to be proposed. And I think that those solutions have to come from the communities of people who were really being harmed by all of this disruptive activity. I think of what happened at Billings Bridge, I think it was called, right?
The Battle of Billings Bridge, yeah.
There you go. Because, the convoy folks were trying to establish another little kind of outpost. And I think, couple thousand people in the neighborhood, they kind of created a blockade. And they were like, y'all are not coming to set up in this neighborhood. Get lost. And this brings us to another fundamental problem of why things move so slowly, to your point, Jessa. And that is that people had to do that shit themselves. There was no one to call upon. This whole client customer service model of public safety where someone else is going to make your neighborhood safe so that you can turn your back on your community and not worry, that's not working. And so only when people showed up of their own accord were they actually able to stop this from happening. And I'll always remember when I was watching the news one evening, an older woman was trying to give an interview to, I think, the CBC about all of the noise and the horns blaring in her neighborhood in Ottawa and how disruptive this was. And a guy from the convoy demonstration saw her talking to the camera, and he came up behind her and he started disrupting her talking and being like, the Trudeau government and the CBC they're all screwing us. And she turned to the guy and she was like, the only people who are disrupting me are you. And she was probably like in her 60s at least, I would say. And, this man was younger than her. And I just thought it was such an interesting moment because he didn't know what to say to her. It's all cool to talk tough against the politicians, to shout at the media cameras and tell them that they're all fascists and all these things. But when a woman who lives in the community and has nothing to do with it except wanting to be left alone tells you you're ruining her day, this guy had nothing for her. And I thought, what if there were 10 of those women? What if there were 100 of them? Like, how would people respond differently if it was people in their own kind of social circle coming up to them and being like, you're really fucking this up by doing what you're doing. And you're really harming a lot of people around you by doing your demonstration in this way. And by the way, we all have to deal with that. A friend of mine told a story online recently, which I shared, where she talked about one of the pro-Palestine solidarity demonstrations being in the way of a vehicle where somebody was having a medical emergency. And luckily, that vehicle was near the front of where the demonstrators were. And the person was really agitated, and one of the marshals went over to them and was like, what's up? And they were like, look, somebody in this car is having a medical emergency. I need to get through here right now. And they were like, boom, into action, cleared everybody out of the way, got that person through. Let's not waste time talking about how lots of people think that they have an emergency and won't be let through. I get that. Public demonstration is what it is. It's always going to be what it is. And I don't take the argument that that can always happen, so we shouldn't ever demonstrate or whatever. But the flexibility of people responding and being like, we don't want you having this emergency to have to sit here. We can do our demonstration and accommodate you. These kinds of things matter. And we should be thinking about them, and we should be looking at them from the other side as well.
I almost don't even know what to say other than who keeps us safe. We keep us safe.
We know, right? We do.
We do. And to Desmond's point there, because I know like some people will cringe when you said it, called it a populist movement. And I agree with you, but there's some contention there. Either way, it sells itself as a populist movement, right? There's no disputing that. And so that's really hard to maintain when you are then faced with the rest of your community telling, like the lady being interviewed, this is not cool. We do not like it. And then it doesn't necessarily have to be a show of force, but this mobilization that disproves your populism. And for the same reason, and because they're decent people, you let through a car with a medical emergency because you need to bring everybody along with you in the end, right? And creating an atmosphere where you're turning on one another and setting the cops on one another in the end is not productive. But yeah, it's impossible for you to build or claim to be a populist movement when you spend your time harming the community.
And I'll say too, populist in the sense that the messaging is populist. Obviously, there was like huge American money coming into Canada and making sure that those people had every resource they needed to stay in the street for as long as they wanted. And so I'm not maybe saying popular, right? They claim to represent a trucking community, 90% of which was vaccinated. Like these people had no friggin' clue what they were talking about. They didn't represent anywhere near the majority of people that they claimed to be. But populist in the messaging, populist in saying there's a problem and it can be very easily solved if we could only get this annoying one thing or one pesky element out of the way, creating very simplistic solutions, right, for actually what's a complex problem. And I'll go in another direction with this as well, okay? I was just invited to a presentation today for Black History Month, and I talked about policing measures during the pandemic, which disproportionately harmed Black people. There's an amazing study out there by Canadian Civil Liberties Association called Stay Off the Grass, which I highly recommend that people look at. And, you know, governments were not keeping a lot of records about who was getting ticketed under these COVID emergency orders, these public health orders. So CCLA did some data gathering on their own, and not surprisingly, what they found was that 2S LGBTQ folks, Black folks, Indigenous folks, unhoused folks were all reporting like, yeah, I'm getting targeted by these COVID enforcement measures. Who the hell could be surprised by that? Of course they were, because that is the general trend in surveillance and policing. And those are the groups that are the easiest to target because enough of society will turn the other way or blame them and say it's their own fault. But this is where I think we had a common cause with people who were actually in the streets of Ottawa. Because I also, in 2020, when it was announced that you would not be able to go to a public park, you could be stopped walking in the streets if you were outside of your house and questioned by the police about why you were outdoors. I freaked the fuck out when this happened, and so did a lot of Black people and Black organizations, because we're like, this is way too familiar to what we've been fighting for so many years. And so people who were making the argument that there was overreach in COVID enforcement had many valid points. I don't agree with them when they just want to do anything that they want to, when they say that, for example, a gym where people can't social distance needing to be closed for a while is a human rights violation. I don't agree with that, okay? But there were absolutely dangerous and harmful overreaches of policing and enforcement, and we were not able to split that difference and effectively push back against the measures that were unnecessary. Because, for example, people do need to go out into the public even when there's a pandemic. And in many cases, being outdoors in a park, for example, is way safer than being inside. And for your own mental health and physical well-being, it's also still important to go outside. We ceded a lot of that ground. And this is, again, like this theme of crisis. So how did we do when the government scared everybody and said, now you will all stay indoors? Most people were like, yes, sir. Yes, master. But then what happened? A year later in 2021, after CCLA had reported that all these marginalized groups were being targeted and harmed, there was another wave of COVID, and the police said, we're doing it again, but now you can't go to the park. The parks are actually closed. We're going to go and put emergency yellow tape around the park, and you won't be able to go to the park with little Johnny, and you'll be stopped in your car. And middle-class white people were like, what the fuck? Like, what? You can't do that to me. And they were outraged. They didn't say anything.
I was mad about that caution tape on my playground, though, I'll tell you.
Sure. But you see my point is that it's not good enough for us to wait for these sensational moments. When they said it the first time, that's when the pushback should have happened. But I didn't see anyone other than Black organizations, indigenous organizations, homeless serving organizations, and individuals. Those were the people who spoke up. And our struggle has something to do with being consistent about these issues when the stakes aren't like middle-class white people are going to get hurt. Right? We have to be able to be consistent about these things, even when it's our political enemies who might benefit from our consistency.
I'm dying to bring up the example of the journalist.
Oh, sorry. Don't forget what you're going to say. I don't want anybody to interpret from what I just said that middle-class white people are our political enemies. That's not, I didn't mean that. I was referring back to the convoy folks. So I just want to be clear about that. I'm sure that a lot of people think that I think that, but whatever.
Well, I appreciate the clarification, Desmond. But yeah, no, as Desmond's saying this, I'm thinking of the case of the Rebel News journalist. You know, we can argue whether he is or isn't a journalist, but I was so disappointed. I was like looking around going, what are you guys doing? Why are you fucking celebrating this? Right? Like, Desmond, tell me you were
David
also...
Menzies.
Yeah, I never say his name.
Didn't you see my tweets? I was freaking
I'm
the
sure
fuck out.
I did. I was also tweeting myself.
Oh my God, I was so mad. So yeah, for people who didn't see it, David Menzies, like a ghoul, certified ghoul from Rebel News, and a man who has harassed me a lot, and he's just awful. But he saw Chrystia Freeland outside of an event that she was going to, or somewhere that she was going. He was waiting for her. He obviously knew she was going to be there. And what did he do? He did what journalists do all the time. He saw her coming. He came and walked up beside her with his microphone. He had a camera person in tow. And he walked alongside Chrystia Freeland and tried to ask her a question. He asks questions that are so dumb that I actually do remember. He was asking whether the Iranian Revolutionary Guard should be classified as a terrorist organization. And
of course he was.
Yeah, he did that. And so Chrystia Freeland wasn't answering him. I don't think she spoke the entire interaction, actually. She just ignored him and kept walking forward with what it looked like a staff member beside her. A police officer who was not dressed as a police officer saw this happening. And he set a pick, as we say in basketball. He went and stood in the path of where he knew David Menzies was going to be walking. And David Menzies couldn't see him because he was too busy looking at Chrystia Freeland while he was trying to speak to her. And so he ran flush into this police officer's chest, whereupon the cop said, "You're under arrest for assault." And boy, was so-called left-wing internet cheering. It's a celebration that David Menzies is finally
He's not a real journalist, they say.
He's not even a real journalist. Yeah.
Cops can do that to us then.
Well, let's talk about that part first, because I'm fucking so tired of this elitist professionalism of journalism garbage. Anyone should be able... Listen, have you guys seen people going up to Trudeau in a restaurant and being like, why are you supporting genocide?
Yeah, we had them on our show.
Okay, guess what? They're not journalists. So what? There should be a circle of cops around them because they are not journalists. And what about all of us freelance journalists? What about all of us journalists who aren't accredited with one of the three major megacorps that do media in Canada? I worked at City Hall for Torontoist for a lot of years. And the rule at Toronto City Hall was, if you didn't have physical space in the building, if you were not leasing physical space inside the press gallery at City Hall, you were not part of the accredited City Hall media, and therefore you could not get a pass. And if you can't get a pass, that means that when the mayor, for example, does a presser in his office, they have the right to deny you, because you're not technically part of the press gallery. That is what happens when we professionalize media to the nth degree and say that only the state-sanctioned questioners are allowed to talk to our politicians. It's such trash. I am so tired of it. Anyone who wants to ask a politician a question in public should have the right to do so. She wasn't being threatened by David Menzies. He was not touching her. And whether you consider him a journalist or not, he doesn't really do the things that I would say a lot of journalists do. That's not the point. I will say that a journalist would be trained not to stand in front of somebody who is walking and block their path, but to do exactly what David Menzies did, which is to walk alongside the person, allow them a path to continue if they don't want to talk to you. and let them go on their way if they don't answer. He did all of those things. And this annoys me so badly because I saw people in the Queen's Park press gallery only a few months ago physically block the path of Sarah Jama, who uses a motorized chair, physically stand in front of her so that she could not leave in a narrow hallway. And Colin DeMello, the head of the press gallery, was leading the charge, standing right in front of Sarah and screaming at a bunch of people around her, which I was one of them, that we were somehow impeding his freedom of expression because we were like, can you move, please? She wants to leave. You can walk beside somebody and ask them questions. And if they don't want to respond to you, then they can just keep going. You can't block their path, though. David Menzies didn't do that, and he still got arrested. And we're friggin' celebrating. And again, it's not that I'm like, oh, you shouldn't celebrate when it happens to him, because then one day it's going to happen to us. Guys, I've been arrested so many fucking times while trying to cover something. I've been harassed and intimidated by police so many times, called names, just like said the most disgusting things to me. It's already happening to so many of us. But then what happened, I think, 24 hours after everyone was celebrating David Menzies getting arrested? Brandy Morin covering the encampment, police dismantling of the encampment in Ottawa. Brandy Morin gets arrested and charged, I think, with obstruction. And boy, were people singing a different tune. But I'm going to say it again. So many people responded for Brandy, which they should do, but they did it for the wrong reason, because she's a professional, because she was doing her job. Well, she was just in there doing her job. I want to ask people something. When you say that the press have freedom of expression and freedom to do whatever you think they're allowed to do in Canada, does that translate into the press having the right to be on city property in an encampment area? And they have the right to be there to watch people whose home that is, whose living space that is, to be evicted. When they went into Wet'suwet'en territory and they got Bracken and Toledano, who were in there as journalists, and pulled them out, people were angry. But I am like, so what are you saying, though? Are you saying that when there's an injunction on Indigenous territory, that the journalists should be allowed to stand there and watch while the cops remove the people who are like, this is my land? And they should be allowed to film unmolested by the police while other people get dispossessed and arrested and beaten down? No, that's not right. So everybody who was standing up for Brandy, cool. But what about all of the people who lost their home that day, who lost the community that they had created together that day, where they were keeping each other safe? What about them? We can't give in to this professionalization of journalism, because then we forget all of the other people who are being targeted by the same practices.
I feel like that is what kind of came out of that particular, I think it was Edmonton encampment, that the focus then was almost entirely on Brandy's situation, and still is, rather than the eviction itself. Like, it definitely became the greater evil that day, even though it's arguably not, and might be separate issues that peak at separate times, people's interests. But yeah, that was a hard time, because Santiago, now that I think about it, we even mentioned your tweet, I believe, in that episode, where you made the point that civilians should also, because it's blueprints of disruption. We're constantly encouraging people to go and challenge folks to be more disruptive, not as journalists, not in any kind of official capacity, but because it's part of democracy.
Yeah, I think it's about public space, because when the cops come to an encampment in Toronto and they build a fence in a public park, what they are telling you, even though I don't think that this is lawful, is that this public space is now made private by our building a fence around it, a makeshift fence. And so now everybody who is inside the makeshift fence is technically on private property and can be forced out. Journalists should be speaking out against that thing. They shouldn't only be speaking out when one of their people inside the fence gets dragged out and arrested or beaten down or whatever the case may be. But you're not going to see the Canadian Association of Journalists taking up the broader issue of the capture of public space through injunctions and through these kinds of police actions. I wish that they would, but I think that this idea of the professionalism of journalism means that they won't do that. But you see how up in arms that they get and how like rights-based and everything that they get when it happens to a journalist who's seen as a professional. Then it's wrong, then it's terrible. Then we can be advocates, because if we lose our ability as journalists to have access, well, I guess the world's going to end. But if other people lose the place that they were living, well, we're just going to go report on that and go home, right? And it's not enough. It's not enough.
There is a line there, though, where, because journalists are usually excellent at being in solidarity with other journalists, except for apparently journalists covering things in Palestine. And then maybe that solidarity doesn't get extended quite as much.
Oh boy, you said it now. You said it. I was really enthused. I'm gonna have to end shortly, but I do. Thank you for saying that, Santiago, because it was a bright spot for me when I'd say somewhere between 150 and 200 journalists got together a couple weeks ago, and we did honor all the journalists who've been killed in Gaza, in Lebanon, and in Israel. We said their names, we told stories, people shared wonderful, wonderful testimonies. I am so grateful to, Fatima Syed and Pasant Matar and the organizers of that event for giving a space for those of us who are concerned as journalists about what's been going on to mourn and to be together. And it was like there was a little after gathering that happened, and just being in the same place with a whole bunch of other people who were sharing that together. It was actually one of the more uplifting things that I've experienced in the last few months since the carnage in Gaza has been ongoing. And so I was actually really grateful for that, and for all of the mainstream media silence and complicity and warmongering. There are still many of us who know what time it is and who are trying to strike a different message. And I was like really, really, really grateful to see that.
Desmond, we've kept you longer than we said we would, but we also did warn you that we could keep you here forever if you let us. But
I could stay if I didn't have to make dinner.
No, we saw you stress eating Jello, so we will let you.
Don't tell people.
All right, fine. We'll edit that one out. But
no, it's fine. Leave it. The people need to know the truth.
We appreciate your time and your advocacy so much. But is there anything we didn't let you spout on that you would like to talk about before?
Yeah, just one thing, because we were talking about policing and the harms that are done every day to people that don't rise to the level of death, which we might not be paying attention to. I have been very fortunate to make friends with a man by the name of Devon Fowlin, who was almost exactly a year ago now, shot by a Toronto police officer in a park. Devon was alone at the time. He was homeless at the time. He was living out of his car. And somebody reported him for having a knife. He did have a knife. He was alone in a park. He kept that knife on his waist because he used to use it for like cutting food and things like that. It was like a kitchen knife that had a sheath. Somebody called the police on him, and several officers responded. And we know now that when they responded, they immediately drew handguns and tasers on Devon. And one of the officers shot him multiple times. Devon survived. And I'm so glad that he did. The reality, though, is that in surviving, life continues to be really, really difficult for him. And I would love for you guys to share with your audience in the notes to this show a GoFundMe. It's called Help Devon Fowlin Continue His Recovery. If you just type in his name into a Google search or an anything search, DEVON you will find his GoFundMe. It has been really hard to raise funds for Devon. He should be on disability because he still has bullet fragments in his body and he's lost the use of fingers on his right arm. They think he will never recover the use of those fingers on his right hand. He cannot work. And he really needs support right now. And it's these kind of things that I'm talking about, where are we for people in our own communities? In the aftermath of George Floyd and awareness raising, where are we when this happens in our own communities for people who really, really need us? So I would ask anyone who's listening, who's able to do so, I know things are tough for a lot of people right now, if you can throw $5 or $10 even to Devon, I know he would really, really appreciate that. And for those who are curious, the officer who shot Devon has actually been charged. And that very, very rarely happens in the province of Ontario or in Canada for that matter. I don't count on the idea that the officer who was charged is going to be convicted. And I don't really care. And when I talk to Devon, he also tells me he doesn't really care. He just wants to be able to carry on his life and be compensated for what has happened to him. But I want people to know that the officer's name is Constable Andrew Davis. And I believe in the practice of naming those people who harm us and in holding them accountable. And whether or not this officer is convicted of a crime, it's not going to change what happened to Devon. And we need to stop this from happening again. I'm sure that when he does go to court, Constable Davis's lawyers are going to frame this in some kind of mental health capacity. It's false. Devon wasn't in crisis until the police came and drew their weapons on him. But even if it was a mental health crisis, are these the people we want responding? Was lethal force necessary to engage a person who was alone in a park walking his dog in the early morning hours in Toronto, who was talking to and bothering no one? Was lethal force necessary? And how many more times for so-called mental health calls are we going to justify the use of lethal force when, if an intervention is needed, if it's needed, any number of non-lethal interventions are also possible? That's what I want to leave you with. And please support Devon Fowlin because he would appreciate it.
We will be sure to link that in the show notes. And we very much appreciate you adding that onto the end. But your time here, I've learned a lot. You've challenged me on some of the lines of thought that I had, and I do very much appreciate that. And
I appreciate both of you for what you're doing. I hope you keep it up, and maybe we can do this again sometime.
We're going to hold you to that.
Yeah, let's do it.
Literally, whenever you want to come on, let us know. It's always
Take it over your show.
Yeah, no problem.
It's mine now. Be careful what you wish for.
I'll change the banner head now. That is a wrap on another episode of Blueprints of Disruption. Thank you for joining us. Also, a very big thank you to the producer of our show, Santiago Halu Quintero. Blueprints of Disruption is an independent production operated cooperatively. You can follow us on Twitter at BP of Disruption. If you'd like to help us continue disrupting the status quo, please share our content, and if you have the means, consider becoming a patron. Not only does our support come from the progressive community, so does our content. So reach out to us and let us know what or who we should be amplifying. So until next time, keep disrupting.